Decoding Future Leadership is an audiovisual podcast breaking open the capabilities, technologies, growth strategies, and mental fitness required to lead our future working world. A collaboration between Peoplestrong, the customer's choice for HR tech across Asia Pacific, and Future Leadership, each episode addresses the challenges of a hybrid workforce with a blend of human capability and HR technology solutions. Let's get into this week's episode.
Hello, my name is David Bowering. I'm from Future Leadership. It's my pleasure to welcome today's guest to our Decoding the Future Leadership podcast, Lisa Annese. Lisa is the CEO of Diversity Council of Australia. It's a pleasure to meet you, Lisa.
It's nice to be here. Thank you.
That's great. Lisa, you're well known for leading a really broad array of both groundbreaking and evidence-based research. I'd like to start, I've heard you speak previously about a sense of fairness and equality always being a part of you and a part of your background. I'm interested in digging a little bit deeper into this and what do you attribute this to in your early experiences?
That's a really hard question to answer because you can have individuals who grow up in similar circumstances, and some people are motivated to, pursue life in one direction and other people in a different direction. It's probably true to say I grew up the daughter of post-war migrant parents, and we were ethnically diverse from the community in which I grew up in. And it was a very, very, white Anglo-Celtic surfing community that I kind of grew up in, and we were different. And that was, I experienced, that kind of exclusion as a child, and that always pointing out of me being different, getting questions like, well, where are you from? With the obvious implication being that I'm not from here.
Yeah, fascinating. It's interesting. As you say, a lot of people have this experience growing up in the 70s and 80s where not much was known about diversity and inclusion as a social concept, and people respond in different ways to that environment.
I think, though, that the only way that you can work in this space effectively is to have a positive attitude and be hopeful for the future. Because if you're not hopeful for the future and that we can move towards a place where we have inclusive communities, representative governments, and engaged workforces where all kinds of people can build their potential, you might as well go home. You would only react to it. I think you've got to have that optimism and that hope that we can be better, especially at the moment in the face of a regression in some human rights spaces, globally, that is. And you've got to recognise that sometimes progress goes backwards before it continues to go forward. There's certainly a concerted push against progressive policies and inclusionary practices in some parts of the world, especially in the gender space. And I think you've got to just be hopeful that, moving towards the future, we can do better.
And as the CEO yourself of Diversity Council Australia, it must be challenging at times to shift your focus from what's in the immediate term, what's present day and real for the workplace and the society now, versus what's, zooming back a bit and looking at the long-term trends and finding some encouragement in what that looks like, as you say, at a global level. How do you as a leader manage that zooming in and zooming out of the perspectives that you need to hold?
My view on what needs to be done is unchanged, and has been unchanged for decades. And I think one of the key things that you have to do if you want to create change is to try not to get distracted by popular trends, because they crop up all the time, and they may or may not be significant, and they may or may not be things that you need to engage with. I mean, certainly the current global conversation around racial justice, that's important. And I think that's been elevated. So that's fantastic. But working in the workforce space, there are always different sort of trends and popular things that crop up from time to time. Everyone becomes obsessed with unconscious bias training, for example. Then everyone becomes obsessed with having conversations around privilege. Then everyone becomes obsessed with whatever the next. And does engaging in these conversations, does it actually create change? That's the question I want to answer, because for me, the end goals are the same. The end goals are that we should have equity of opportunity amongst all citizens of any nation state to engage in the workforce, to be an active carer at home, to have economic prosperity, to live a life free from harassment, discrimination and violence, to be able to exist as you are authentically in the world without fear of being shamed and degraded just for being who you are, and the responsibilities that go along with that. So I think keeping your eye on that's the end goal. Sometimes what you have to do is critically analyze trends and popular things that happen and see, well, is this something I need to pay attention to? Is this going to make a difference to achieving that end goal? Because, for example, unconscious bias training, and we do unconscious bias awareness at DCA, but there's actually no evidence to suggest that it's going to create anything significant in the way of change in terms of outcomes in a workplace. And yet organisations spend enormous amounts of money on that. And that's money and resources that they now don't have to focus on stuff that could make a difference. So I think it's important to analyse and assess popular trends and try and be quite critical and analytical about them, because and this is actually a really interesting thing, because in the space where I work at, a lot of well-meaning people spend a lot of time and energy focused on activities that don't create any change. And so you've got to take that evidence perspective and have a look at, is it worthwhile engaging in this? And have your eye always on the long term.
I'm interested in the role that technology plays in this space that you talk about, and social media is part of this. And I'm interested in your thoughts on the leadership challenge for leaders of organizations who are having to work through almost too many data points and too many opinions, and that might, as you say, distract them from what actually creates value in the workplace and in the broader community. What are the capabilities that are important for leaders of business nowadays in order to really make a meaningful impact on inclusion in the workplace?
Well, a leader, and you don't have to be a leader in an organisation, you could just be an ordinary participant of that workplace, but it requires the same kinds of skills. You need to be open. You need to have a growth mindset about change. You need to be prepared for change and be willing to take a risk on it. You need to understand why diversity and inclusion matters, because you need to understand that in business terms. It's not enough just to have a moral, just have your heart in the right place. You need to understand why this needs to be a conversation for organisations, and why you can do better as an organisation. You can be a more effective organisation if you do tap into your diversity and become more inclusive of diverse groups. And then you need to be the kind of leader that is then able to make diverse teams effective. And that means having not just a growth mindset around that, but having a focus on genuine inclusion. And genuine inclusion is about much more than representation. It's around understanding your priority areas and understanding what are the ways in which you make those diverse groups included in a workforce. Because if you do, you will benefit from a productivity perspective, from an engagement and loyalty perspective, from a innovation perspective, and you'll reduce your risk as an organisation. But how you get there is a process. So just being diverse is not enough. It's how to make that mix of people work. And at DCA, we have a definition for diversity, but we have a definition for inclusion. And you mentioned in your opening remarks about our inclusion index. And in our inclusion index, we actually are able to empirically measure how inclusive an organisation is and what that then means for their effectiveness. So we measure inclusion in terms of, inclusion for us means that the organisation is respectful. It means that the organisation is a place where people feel humanly connected to one another, so that sense of belonging. It needs to be a place where people have opportunities for progress or advancing, depending on the size of your workplace, of course, and an organisation where individuals have jobs that are designed effectively so that what they do adds value and matters. And so it's not just about giving people, a sense of belonging. It's not just about having a women's group in the workplace. It's about making sure the job they have is meaningful. If they've gone on parental leave, they've returned back, they don't just fall off the career trajectory, that there's some kind of way that you're tapping into their talent. All those things need to be in place for the workplace to measure as an inclusive workplace. And only then will it get the benefits of being more innovative, enabling people to give discretionary effort, and having more effective decision making.
I think what I like about those outcomes from your Inclusion at Work Index findings is they're incredibly sensible. These just make good business sense, and in a space where organisations are dealing with changing environments, changing market conditions, changing workforce, labour shortages. And I've got some data points here that around mental health, and workers in inclusive teams are 4 times less likely to feel their work has a negative impact on their mental health, 11 times more likely to be seen as effective, and 10 times more likely to be innovative in how they approach challenge in the workplace. That all sort of adds up to me to be around psychological safety and accessibility into decision making for the business. Interested in your reflections on that nest of elements and how it relates to the retention of talent.
Because individuals in a workplace shouldn't be in an environment that is harmful to them. And so your mental health and well-being should be as important as, employers' obligations around the physical workspace being a space that minimises hazards. Now, what that looks like is harder to understand because workplaces can be, they can be places where there is stress. There can be places where there is tension, sometimes conflict. Is all of that unhealthy? Not necessarily. But it's about ensuring as an organisation you are not enabling a culture that makes people mentally unwell. And so, that's taken sometimes to mean that people should be operating always in a state of feeling amazing at work. And that's just not realistic sometimes, because sometimes work, you can be under pressure, you can be having to meet a deadline. It's about what's reasonable from a workplace perspective. And what's interesting is what I'm seeing some organisations trying to navigate. When you out yourself as a workplace that's focused on diversity and inclusion and psychological safety, then what you're also signaling to your employees is that there's a higher bar at this workplace. And then what you have to navigate is how people interpret that. And I think that that's really interesting. And that's actually quite a hard thing to be able to do. So the idea that someone should come to work and never be intellectually challenged, or if someone's unable to receive constructive feedback because they find it upsetting, I mean, clearly that is unreasonable. I mean, so we have to, when we say psychological safety, we have to say that within the parameters of, reasonable day-to-day management, because sometimes managers have to give difficult feedback to people. The key is, do you do it respectfully? Do you do it while preserving the individual's integrity, or are you a bully when you do it? And so it's not the giving of the feedback that's the issue, it's the manner in which that's done. And so that's where and it's really hard to do that kind of stuff. And if you have two people, say, in your team who are diametrically opposed in terms of their relationship to each other, and it's causing stress for both of them, they will want very different resolutions from that interaction. And so what you have to focus on is, behaviours and processes that are reasonable and acceptable to happen in the workplace context, as opposed to eliminating anything that might be potentially stressful or potentially challenging or complex, because life is challenging and complex, and life can be really stressful. Workplaces can be challenging and complex and can be stressful, and we cannot eliminate everything. What we can do is make sure that we do everything we can to regard the dignity of our colleagues and all the individuals in our environment. And that's what we mean. So it's less black and white than physical safety.
And you raise an interesting point there about, at the moment of tension. So I think one of the interesting things is that most reasonable people will say respect and dignity, and let's treat everyone with those tenements is reasonable and uncomplicated to display, until there is pressure and challenge and the heat's turned up, and it's at those moments where definitions of respect versus what's on the table, the stakes of the business, come into play. And so I think that's where the complexity sort of comes in. And what you said before about leaders being mindful about those moments, about recognizing when the temperature is raised and having the presence of mind to go, okay, here's a moment of risk where I've got to be mindful of those boundaries.
Absolutely. And I think that you have an obligation to support staff and to ensure that work doesn't contribute to ill health in an unreasonable way. Obviously, work should never make people sick, but that individuals all have different points of resistance.
Yeah.
And people have varying degrees of resilience. And some people are really Teflon, and some people are really, really sensitive and experience things more intensely than others. And that's hard to know.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Being able to recognise where people's tension points are for themselves, as well as for other people, the other people in the room, and how are they experiencing the interaction. One person might think we're still within the bounds of respect and reasonableness.
Yeah,
and there might be a different experience from the other side of the room.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. I'd like to shift gears in terms of the most, the last 2 years. It'd be remiss of me not to pull out the impacts of COVID. And one of the things that we've seen is that organisations needed to and did operationalise technology at a rapid rate in order to respond to the pressures that the global pandemic brought upon. And technology, as we've said, can be a two-edged sword. It can be used both as a positive means of engagement and communication, and there's a negative shadow element to that. Interested in your thoughts on how organisations can better utilise technology moving forward to help with inclusion in the workplace.
Well, technology is a real enabler of workplace participation because it enables flexibility in the place where you work, and certainly we saw a mass move to remote working due to COVID, but also in terms of the time you can work and your access to information and your ability to, you've got more resources at your fingertips now than we've ever had before. But it can also be a terrible curse at the same time. It can mean you never switch off from work. It can mean if you're relying on technology to interact with people all the time, those interactions may not be as rich as they could be, and so therefore you won't build team cohesion in a way that you could. You don't get incidental collaboration that you do in a physical space, for example. So whilst technology affords people a lot of opportunities, you've got to be mindful of what the limitations are and also what are the problems that technology can create. And so, for example, if we think about the impact of COVID on and how it's enabled all of this remote working, which has been great, but there is a place for people coming together. And our model of inclusion includes the quadrant of connection, human connection. And even the most introverted of people benefits from, coming together in a real place in situ and connecting with other people. And so the question then becomes not how does technology enable work, but how do we structure our job? So how do we design work so that we enable the best opportunity for the greatest inclusion possible? And for some people, that will be a hybrid working model. For some people, it will be return to the office. Some people are able to do it even physically in remote locations. And indeed, it has to be that way in some workforces. If you're the only person in the Sydney office and the rest of your team works in Melbourne, then you have no choice. So there are things that you can do, but it's about the job design. And then ultimately comes down to the capability of the leader and the manager and how they set the tone. And what do you artificially create in that kind of environment which can contribute to that connection piece? Because it's really vital. It's really important. And I think workplaces are struggling to get people back into the office. And we had just at DCA, we've obviously not been together for a long time, but we had a couple of weeks ago our first in-office event where we all came together for a team day. And when I say we couldn't all, only the people who could travel to Sydney and were and could meet the vaccination requirements could do it. So it was not all of us, it was half the team. But it was amazing to be together. And I think that I just came away from that convinced that we've got to have some kind of hybrid model for us as an organisation because, the work we do at DCA can be really stressful because we're trying to create change. And whenever you're trying to create change in a space that's challenging, it can take its toll on individuals. And one of the ways you build individual resilience is through human contact, human interaction, and building those connections. And so that's got to be important. It's got to be a focus area for us as an organisation and for others.
This podcast is created by Fisher Leadership and proudly sponsored by Peoplestrong. Here's a message from Peoplestrong CEO Sandeep Chowdhury.
We indeed are living in the era of talent economy. The talent economy fundamentally for us means looking at the world of work, workplace, and workforce very differently than what we've essentially experienced and known in the pre-pandemic world. We fundamentally believe that experience, collaboration, and data will actually differentiate the best from the rest. With that ambition, Peoplestrong has brought the first talent operating system to enterprises to essentially be able to personalize the employee journey right from the hiring into the learning, performance, and the career management stage of every employee. We've done that with massive amount of AI and ML that will bring in the right decisions for an employee and for the enterprises to essentially take the biggest advantage of the crisis that we're just coming out of.
It's a great example of I think one of the tension points that leaders I see struggling with is, and your example there of your own experience with DCA, looks at the energy that's created from a physical sense of belonging to the organisation, while at the same time saying not everybody could be there. And so in a sense that conflicts with the definition of inclusion, in terms of how does everyone have access. And I wonder how, or what advice might you have for leaders contemplating this binary question of how do I include everyone, while at the same time that physical connection is just not always possible.
I think it's important not to be binary about it, because even if you can't have an absolute positive outcome for every individual, even if you can just have an impact on some or half or 3/4, you should still go ahead with it. And I know that sounds really harsh because it means some people are missing out. But if you're waiting for the perfect to happen, you'll be waiting forever. And that's in everything. I mean, it's in working in the D&I space, sometimes you have to just go with a little bit less worse than what it previously was, because aiming for perfection is a pipe dream. It's so far off. No organisation's achieved it. And so if you're saying, well, unless it's 100% perfect, we're not going to do it, I think, and people are like, there are people, activists in this space who very much are that way. They're very pure. They've got very Puritan ideas about anything less than this is a failure. And I don't agree with that. And I think that the evidence shows that change in this space is incremental, and you create change by changing individuals. Systems change because individuals change. So even if you can only influence 50% of the people in the system, that's better than influencing 0%. So I just think that the operating in the binary, I don't subscribe to that, because I think you'll be waiting forever and a day. And then whose definition of perfect are you going off? It's because if you ask 100 people, and these are the challenges of working in D&I, what the solution is, you'll get 100 different responses. And so you'll invariably disappoint some people. So you might as well just get on with it, and try and do a little bit and try and move forward, even if it's with a smaller group of people, because that's still progress.
Yeah. I think that's really useful advice. And one of the, it challenges some of the social, the messages through social media about, which can get quite emotional, and within organisations and also within communities, about what can be perceived as a high standard of what inclusion looks like. So,
and the fact that in that type of scenario that people are reduced to their worst day. It's such a pessimistic view of humanity. And it's so judgmental. And it's not to say, I mean, if people do terrible things, then they should be held to account for doing terrible things. But having the wrong opinion is not set in stone. I mean, the wrong opinion, according to who? I mean, obviously, I want people to be diverse and inclusive and to value that. But I wouldn't cancel someone because they didn't agree with me. And I think that what happens if you stop talking to people who don't share your views, or because you perceive them as being less as letting you down, you will miss every opportunity to create positive change. And everyone is better than their worst day at work. Everybody is better than the worst mistake and worst decision that they've ever made. And people have the capacity to change. And if you remove that opportunity for people to learn and grow, then you will never create change in this space. And then you know what? It's like people in glass houses. All of us make mistakes. None of us have perfect days every day. And all of us can look back on our attitudes historically and think, oh, now with new information, I would recalibrate that. You can't hold individual. I mean, with the exception of anything that's criminal, and of course, breaching things like the Sex Discrimination Act and harassing people. I mean, I'm talking about grey areas. You've got to be able to bring people along a journey and not use today's morality to judge behaviour that might have happened, you know, a generation ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. As long as people need to be moving in the right direction, and you miss those opportunities. Now, what I'm saying, there'll be people who listen to this podcast who probably think, well, I don't agree with that. And all I can say to people who have such a pessimistic view of human behaviour is that if you want to work in the change space, then you've got to hold on to the idea that everybody can change. And for people to change, you've got to engage with them, because unless you are, you've got to engage with them and you've got to bring them along the journey. That's the only way forward.
I think the other element of that comes into play around change is, as you say, change is not a linear experience. Change is a couple of forward steps, a couple of backward steps when you look at it within a particular time frame. And for leaders, for anyone to have the confidence to move through the process and, as you say, ride the waves and be okay with the dips as they take place, as long as the trajectory broadly is heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely agree. And I think that sometimes it means that you should not be, you should always, that's why the long term and the big picture, we started the conversation with the long term and the big picture. That's always got to be top of mind.
Yeah.
Because if you're focusing on the everyday and what today's morality, and someone steps a toe out of line and then they can never be redeemed, it's just, you might as well give up and go home. I'm in the business of trying to make things better, and to do that, I've seen people capable of extraordinary change who have come from places where if they'd been written off in those early days, because everyone is a culmination of their experiences. And if your eyes haven't been open to what it's like to walk a day in someone else's shoes, and you don't have that, you've either not acquired that knowledge intellectually or through a human experience, I think it's unfair. Where I think we have the right to be judgmental is when people, in the face of all the available information, when they've participated in the conversation, when they've had the opportunity to understand how the world could be better, and then they self-select out of that, then I think you can say, well, I think that's bigoted. I think that's narrow. That's small-minded. But, you know, sometimes it's important to recognise that, because people like me, for example, I'm immersed in this all the time. Most people who are doing other kinds of jobs, they're not. And so therefore, you can't expect them to be a world practice expert, a leading expert on, feminist principles in the corporate space. What you can expect to do is to say, hey, do you realise that if by not calling out harassing behaviours, and you've promoted someone who's sort of turned a blind eye to this kind of stuff, that's creating a culture in your organisation that says this sort of behaviour is okay. If then they go, oh, well, it is okay, then write them off. But if that you're able to bring them along, that's the important thing that I think.
I'm interested, as you're talking, you're in the deep of this topic around diversity and inclusion, and you've got through your research capabilities a lot of evidence to support the trends that are happening in the emerging workforce space. What surprises you, Lisa, in terms of what are the things that are cropping up that you didn't expect or you didn't anticipate that either positively or negatively have surprised you?
That's a good question, because you're asking me about what surprises me. And even though I suppose I'm always learning, and obviously I've got personal experiences in some diversity inclusion areas, but not in others. And so, I'm always learning, and you've always got to take the view that someone knows something that you don't. And you need to have an open mind in the face of new information and be prepared to revise your current views. I mean, if you'd asked me when I started off in this career what I thought a utopia would have looked like, it would have been really different to what I think now.
Tell me about that. Tell me what's shifted and because you talked a little bit earlier on in our conversation about a picture of what the future workplace looks like, which I really liked and relate to. Interested in how that shifted over time.
Because I think I took for granted when I was younger that equality was the outcome that we should be pursuing. And what I mean by that was I started off working in this space focused on gender diversity and thinking that success would happen when 50% of the boardrooms are populated by women, 50% of parliament's populated by women, and where women have access to all of the opportunities that men have access to. And I have shifted that view because I actually think that end view is wrong. It's like the difference between being an equality feminist and a liberation feminist. They're very different outcomes. The equality feminist says, I want 50% of what men have. The liberation feminist says, I actually think the system doesn't work. And what I want is the freedom for women to live the full lives that they want to live, and for men as well. And I want them to be liberated from the idea. In the 70s, the idea was liberated from the kitchen, liberated from domestic drudgery. Liberation to me now looks like being a slave to your workplace, men not being able to be active carers of their children. They're being trapped within the confines of, what is socially constructed in terms of the expectations of your gender. Those are the things I want to break away from. And that's a very different game because the game should be that we want opportunity for everyone so that everyone can make their choices. And that might mean that the outcome is not what people initially anticipate.
Fascinating. And, I always, when I think about the objective of having 50% representation in management or in boards or those sorts of things, I think about, well, if we get to, if and when we get to that level, what do? Do we sort of dust our hands and pat each other on the back and say we've done it? And, I think that's not the case. I think what we're looking to do is create a very different experience in the workplace and in the community for everyone. And I think limiting to a 50% representation goal, in a sense, sets our sights reasonably low.
Yeah, and it also means that it's a numbers game, and it's not. Look, the numbers are important because, obviously, we do want gender representative decision-making bodies in corporations, in government, in any other kind of institution or anywhere where power is distributed, because that's good for not just the individuals themselves, but it leads to better decision making for everybody. So that's certainly an important aspiration, but it's the why is really important. And so, for example, one of the boards that I sit on is an organisation called Women for Election Australia, and that is the idea that we need to have a gender equal parliament. And what the research shows is that if you have gender equal, the more gender equal a parliament is, and it doesn't matter what politics the women are, so whether they're progressives or conservatives, you get better policy decisions for women and children in the community. You get more support for childcare. You get better support for maternal health initiatives. The outcomes are great for humans on the outside. So for me, the numbers are important because they enable the outcomes for everybody. They're not the end in themselves. It's what they will enable. And a gender equal parliament, even with the women don't have to be progressives, they can be conservatives. You will still get better outcomes in general, not always, but in general, you'll still get better outcomes for citizens if you have gender equality in parliament. On the measures that are important to me, health, education, wellbeing. The societies that have moved closest to it, so the Nordic countries that have moved closest to it, they have the highest happiness scores in the OECD.
Yeah.
For all individuals in the community.
And I think that's the critical point, and sometimes the point that doesn't emerge, and that there's examples around in the parental leave space for in the workplace, that men have been a beneficiary, or fathers in particular have been a beneficiary of the advances that have been made in the parental leave provisions and conditions for employees. And so I think this sense that from a diversity and inclusion activation process only supports those people in that subgroup is a misnomer. It's a myth.
Yeah, there's no evidence to support that.
And evidence
the idea
to the
that
contrary.
This is a zero-sum game, absolutely to the contrary. Our every 2 years when we do our inclusion reports, it shows that if you become inclusive as an organisation, even if you only focus on initiatives to improve the number of women in leadership, you'll have better outcomes for men in the workplace, and that actually men's expectations are changing. They want what was unthinkable for them. So it started off with women wanting what men have, and now a lot of men are saying, well, you know what, we want those choices to be active carers at home as well without our careers suffering. And what the research shows is that men who ask for flexibility in order to care are amongst the most excluded people from the career trajectory. So it's important to recognise that to maximise genuine choice, we need to focus on equality for marginalised groups. And in the workplace in Australia, women are one of those groups that have traditionally been excluded from power, on a whole bunch of measures. There's a pay gap. Women experience harassment and violence in bigger numbers in workplaces. So it's really important to focus on that. But the benefits aren't just for the women; they're for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa, just as a final question, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we the community can maintain that human element of the individual connection, as you mentioned, with technology increasing as part of the dynamic. How do employees manage that sense of belonging at a level of humanness, if that makes sense?
Well, you just have to hang out together. You have to hang out together. You have to have a culture of respectful communication. You've got to design work in a way that facilitates that. You have to cultivate a reward system that recognizes particular effort that creates those sorts of behaviors. So, for example, if you've got a really hyper-competitive workspace and you've cultivated that as a culture, that's really not effective in terms of enabling human connection other than for the in-group, who are the hyper-competitive people. So you've got to try and create a structure in your workplace, a reward structure that focuses on encouraging the kinds of behaviours that will lead to that connection. And you've got to design connection in a way that is inclusive. So don't just let, I remember it used to be the days that the CEOs would always, they'd have things like golf days and everyone, and, that's great if you play golf. And I think in more recent times, I've seen people do cycling things. I think that can be great for the people who enjoy those sorts of activities, but you've got to design activities in a way that enables everyone to be part of it. And that means you have to think of things across cultural lines, across health, across disability and accessibility lines. You've got to think about things in the context of what are people's obligations outside the workplace with respect to caring responsibilities. So that will lead you down a path of making sure that whatever you do in terms of your engagement points, it's as inclusive as it can be. And so you've got to try and artificially create that. But I think we need to also do things in person together. We need to have that human connection. That won't be universal, but it's very important.
And I think the other element to that is co-creation. There's no one person, or it's not the responsibility of the leader to say, here's what we're going to do. And I think that's what created the golf days and cricket days in the past is
I know.
The boss
I would
just
always
said,
joke with I know. I always joke with my team that when we organise events and say, what should we do? I said, don't ask me. If you leave it up to me, we'll all be attending a sci-fi convention. Let's do something that, and like that population one in my organisation, who's going to enjoy that? So you've got to let that be led and designed by people other than the leadership group, because they will impose their blueprint. And then what that basically says is that you have to be like me to be a leader. And that's what's happened. And it hasn't been done consciously. So you've got to broaden that out a bit. And then go through a checkbox exercise because even getting diverse groups of people together, you work your way through accessibility and inclusion. Do I have, in the same way that if you're booking a restaurant for a bunch of friends, you'd consider everyone's dietary requirements. You got to do that as well. But it's not just about those one-off events. It's about the everyday. How do you come together regularly? How do you check in with people to see how they're doing? Do you do pulse surveys? Do you have other ways of checking in? And then what are the behaviours you tolerate in your workplace? Because if you turn a blind eye, I think one of the best policies I ever heard, I think Netflix and Atlassian have a policy called no brilliant jerks, they call it. No brilliant jerks. So if you're a rainmaker, but you behave badly, that's not on. And I think too many times people think this person's a superstar, so I'm just going to turn a blind eye to the fact that they're also a bully. And that you will end up having to undo a whole lot of damage if you do that. So you need to call out that behaviour, even if that person's a rainmaker, because in the end, they're going to cost you more money.
And that is a shift. That is an absolute shift from the workplaces that I've been involved with, and growing up through the 80s and 90s, where rainmakers were the unicorns. And I think now emerging out of the current climate, what employers are looking for in terms of unicorns is far more accessible, far more inclusive, and broader, more human capabilities, and the ability to collaborate across different teams and functions in order to be productive for their workplace.
Because ultimately, organisations are only systems of people. And so being good with people is the most important thing in any organisation.
Exactly. Lisa, thank you so much for your time today. Great to discuss these things. I think, really excited by the pragmatic and practical approach that you take to the questions about diversity and inclusion, and also the changing nature of being able to make mistakes and being okay with that. And I really like the mindset of, if I'm having a bad day, but my intention and my objectives and who I am as a person are better than this, and this is what I'm going to strive to achieve. I think that's a really nice message for our employees there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's it for today's episode of Decoding Future Leadership. Thanks for listening. We'd really love to hear how your workplace is combining human capability and HR technology to redesign our hybrid working environments. Please like, comment, share and subscribe to help us create a world of difference. Brought to you by Peoplestrong and Future Leadership.